Welcome to another episode of Harlem Stories. I'm Robert Lazo,
And I'm Adam Feinberg.
and this episode we are going to be talking about townhouses.
Awesome. Harlem is filled with townhouses, and I think it's part of what helps make the neighborhood so unique. People talk about Brownstone, Brooklyn, but Harlem has got just as many townhomes as you'll see in these Brownstone, Brooklyn neighborhoods.
And what is it that makes Harlem townhouses unique in comparison with Brooklyn?
I don't know that necessarily that the townhouses are unique from Brooklyn, but I think it's really just the neighborhoods themselves and just the characteristics, the location, the feel for it. But I don't know necessarily that the townhouses are necessarily different. Maybe there might be in pricing, but maybe not.
Okay, so do you want to talk a little bit about different types of townhouses?
Yeah. So I think some of the most important aspects that we come across in terms of townhouses is the types of construction and some of the design elements. So, right now, I think a lot of people tend to call townhouses brownstones, and brownstones are actually a particular type of stone that's used in the front of the house. So not all townhouses are going to be brownstones. They could be of varying different construction elements. I think, when you're distinguishing, though, townhouses, like you could have like a single townhouse of one style, or you can have what's known as a row house. And the row houses tend to be, almost as the name implies, a row of houses, and they tend to be of a similar look and feel and style. So that discusses, a little bit of, that aspect. But townhouses can be made of the brownstone, which, is one of the more desirable styles. Also limestone, another desirable kind of material. And, depending on it, it could be marble, it could be brick. And, I guess some of the oldest brownstones would be wood frame, or townhouses, would be the wood framed homes. Not too many of those exist remaining, but those tend to be some of the earliest homes in New York City.
I'm thinking of one particular location, which isn't in Harlem specifically, it's in Washington Heights, which is Sylvan Heights.
Oh, yeah, Sylvan Terrace. Sylvan Terrace is absolutely gorgeous, and it kind of has this almost like Revolutionary War kind of feel to the homes. So when you think, of the Battle of Harlem Heights, which was with George Washington, it was in that vicinity of where those homes went up.
Okay, and those are wood framed.
Those are wood framed, and actually something important to be aware of in terms of the wood framed homes, and this is something to be taken consideration when people are considering buying a townhouse. Now, granted, usually the people that have the ability to afford a townhouse, it's not as much of an issue, but for the buyer that just isn't aware and doesn't want to get kind of sticker shock, is those wood frame homes are far more expensive to insure. Just because of housing code changes and the likelihood of in a fire of the entire home just going up in flames. So, as beautiful as they are far more expensive to insure. And just keep in mind, the typical townhouse in Manhattan, while they may be made of brick and stone, the interior is entirely framed in wood, unless it's a brand new construction, which there are a handful of those, that can be found, but only a handful. So the vast majority of time, they are going to be wood framed on the interiors, even though the exterior is stone.
Okay, and if someone is interested in purchasing a townhouse, what are the considerations that they should kind of have in mind?
So, I think most people that are buying a townhouse, first off, they want a backyard. They want the privacy, they want the backyard, and, that is a component. Usually the homes that, at least in Upper Manhattan, the homes that are on avenues tend to have very small yards. So that is something that should be taken into consideration. The typical townhouse lot is going to be usually around 99 feet deep on a typical street, and that's your typical townhouse. Now, it's usually the width that varies quite dramatically, and the width is usually going to wind up determining how much natural light is going to wind up coming into the home. And with that natural light, especially, let's say, if you're comparing a home that might be 15 feet wide versus something that's 18 feet wide, you might have an additional window, on the exterior. So that's going to determine the amount of light that comes in. However, just the fact that these homes generally had very, very wide staircases, it eats into your usable square footage. So you really do feel a big difference, when you have those wider homes.
So let me just, I'll go back to in terms of width, but you had just mentioned that if a townhouse is on an avenue, chances are it's going to have a smaller backyard?
Correct. In most cases, correct.
And if it's on a street, it will have a much larger or deeper backyard?
Correct. And usually for most of the ones on the street, they have a pretty standard depth of 99 feet.
And if we are talking about width, the significance of width has to do with the amount of light that will be, natural light that will be able to enter the house itself.
Yeah, it's both natural light and your ability to use the space on the interior as well.
Okay, so what's the range in terms of the different widths that you're familiar with in terms of townhouses?
So I can tell you the vast majority of the townhouses that we tend to find in Upper Manhattan, they do tend to skew on the narrower side, with the vast majority being in the 15 to 17 foot wide vicinity. You can find, I've seen townhouses as narrow as 12 feet, kind of rare, but I have seen them. And you can find them as wide as 25 feet, I've seen in a handful of instances. And perhaps even potentially even a little wider, but those are really rare. Hardly ever come to the market. Anything wider than, let's say, 22 feet is pretty rare.
And in most cases, a townhouse is going to obviously need to accommodate a staircase. It's right smack in the middle of the house, or actually can be on one side or the other.
It usually tends to be kind of like in the center of the house in terms of the depth. But they do tend to be rather wide. So they do tend to take up a large portion of, your usable square footage. And it kind of, sets the tone for what you can do with the spaces on the interior.
And of course, staircases themselves are actually a beautiful feature of a townhouse in terms of the aesthetics and, of course, just the function of being able to go walk up the stairs and down the stairs.
Yeah, I mean, especially if you get one of the original pre-war, types of staircases, they were very, very artistic and ornate with them. I've even seen a few that actually have a landing, between the levels, and on that landing, they actually have a built-in seat.
And what's that seat for?
Actually, I still don't know to this day, but I gotta say, maybe if you're older and you needed a break to catch your breath, that's a great plate. We've had one client that even called it the naughty seat for raising her children.
And maybe another use of that landing seat would be a place to put on or take off your shoes.
It could be. I mean, generally, usually at the entryway, you had like a mirror and, like a stand where you could, put your umbrellas and take off your shoes. So that'd be probably the more common, area to do it. But sure, why not?
Maybe the slipper station. So maybe not your shoes, but you can...
there you go, the slipper station.
Pick up your slippers on the way up, put them on as you get to the top, the middle point of the stairs, and then you'll have them on when you're at the top.
Yeah, absolutely. It all depends on, what the owners have done with the home over the years and some of the features, because, some of these were in poor condition and, some of the original details were just not restorable. So on occasion, or even you just have an owner that says, what, I wanted the space, I wanted the privacy of a townhouse, but at the same time, I wanted something entirely modern. You'll see them gutted, and, I don't see too many of those, but they do come up from time to time. More often than not, you'll see, a lot with the original detail, or as much as, had been able to be salvaged, over the last 100 years or so, because the vast majority of these were built at least in Upper Manhattan, they tended to be built in like the 1890s through the 1920s or so. So they tend, at that time they treated even something as basic as a staircase as an artistic expression. And you'll tend to see very, very ornate details in some of the railings and the stairs themselves.
So when someone is considering purchasing a townhouse, what are the things that they need to know?
So, it's kind of like buying a house in many respects of like buying anywhere else. However, there are things that are specific to New York City. So, in terms of, what the things that you want to consider is certificate of occupancy. A lot of homes in these that were, since we did, talk about when they tended to be built, that was before the certificate of occupancy system in Manhattan. So a lot of times they might not necessarily have a certificate of occupancy.
So what's the significance? Do you always need to have a certificate of occupancy?
For these townhouses, because they pre-existed beforehand, no. However, if it's going to be a multifamily, more than two families, then you're probably going to need that certificate of occupancy. There are going to be certain requirements because now you're talking about it as if it's a multifamily, and multifamily homes do have certain requirements, such as you need to have sprinkler systems installed into the house. And, that can be something really expensive, to consider in the cost of a house. And that could cost you $100,000 or more to install it if it's not there.
So a certificate of occupancy basically is how the townhouse is allowed to be used. Is that a fair definition?
Well, it's not just townhouses. It also applies to all homes throughout the city. But yes, I would say that does include townhouses, and yes, that would be an accurate description. It's not in every home is going to have it just simply because it predated the system. So it's not essential to have in every single townhouse, but if you are going to have it as a multifamily, you are going to want to have it. Now, what happens if the townhouse has a certificate of occupancy, but the house doesn't necessarily meet the same description as what the city knows? So it's going to really, depend on if it's going to be, let's say, if it's registered as the city as a two-family, but it's being used as a one-family, there's a lot risk to the owner, to the city as a one-family. So that's not really of too much concern, although, obviously that could have an impact on potential impact on some taxes. Perhaps you're paying a little too much more, but maybe not. There's a lot of variables in the tax system that very few people understand, including myself. As much as I understand the way our tax system works, some of these things do not necessarily make sense.
So just, again, a certificate of occupancy can have a townhouse as a one-family townhouse. It could have it as a two-family townhouse. And then if you go beyond two-family, does it say three or four family?
Yes, it does. And if you're going, four-family or above, it's going to depend on your use in terms of financing. And while it's a separate topic, it is interrelated there. So, yes, it will say three-family, four-family, five-family, six, whatever. It will tell you how many, families there are in terms of it. I can tell you in terms of, let's say if you're buying as a primary residence, even if you want those investment units in the home, typically if you want to use a regular banker, without going to the commercial route, it's got to be a 1 through 4 family, and you have to be able to live in one of those apartments. Now, if it's a 4 family and you're not living in it, then it's going to wind up going to the commercial lending route. So yeah, that is something that you'll want to take into consideration, because sometimes people are like, oh, I want as many, tenants as possible. I want as much rental income as we can, possibly get. And, the things like that need to be taken into consideration when buying a townhouse.
So let me ask about one specific type of housing definition, which is the single room occupancy.
The single room occupancy, very, very difficult types of purchases, but it is actually quite common in Harlem. It was once actually very, very common throughout the city and found extensively on the Upper West Side. This type of housing on the Upper West Side is primarily now mostly been converted into proper, residences. These go by a number of different names. They go by boarding houses, rooming houses. They go as SROs. They go as flop houses. I've also heard them called hotels too.
Bed and breakfast?
Bed and breakfast too, yeah. Can't forget that as well.
And I think is one of the qualities of an SRO or single room occupancy. You have a room, but oftentimes you are sharing, let's say, a bathroom.
Yeah, very often you're sharing the bathroom and the kitchen. Not always, but in many of these SROs, that's usually the expectation.
What if a certificate of occupancy has it listed as an SRO? What are the things that need to be considered if that's the case?
So these homes that are considered SROs, first off, to understand that these are not the same thing as a market rate housing. Number one, banks generally will not finance in these homes. If they will, it's going to be a very small percentage of the purchase price. These are in essence because you're renting out as individual rooms and, not as, true, family, homes. A lot of times some of the requirements, to wind up converting, first off, the city is going to, basically look to any residents that were renting in there, find out if they were harassed to leave. If they were potentially harassed, that could be a problem in trying to convert it to a legal 1 through 4 family or, whatever the orientation might wind up being. So let's say if you bought one of these, you paid all cash, you want to convert it to regular housing, what would the steps be? Were you going to go to the Department of Buildings and say, I'd like to file for a certificate of non-harassment? And that's the first step in wind up to make the home into a regular 1 through 4 family, which is typically what these would wind up being. And, and the city will, once you've filed that paperwork, the city will go back to any past tenants that they've known that have lived in the building for over the last 5 to 8 years, and they will go back and ask them, point blank, were you harassed to leave this home? And if the answer is no, then great, they move on. But if anybody says, yes, I was harassed to leave, the city could basically say, nope, you cannot convert this into a 1 through 4 family home. This will have to remain an SRO because you have harassed these tenants. And as punishment, they could wind up saying, and often do, say, you cannot make any major changes to this home other than for basic maintenance purposes for the next 8 years.
So this responsibility of getting a certificate of non-harassment, if the intention is to convert it from being an SRO to something else, is that the responsibility of the owner only?
So, yeah, whoever owns the home, it's their responsibility if they want to convert it that way. For financing purposes, since these are so difficult to finance, before somebody were to sell, my recommendation is they do apply to get that certificate of non-harassment. It could take a while before you actually get approved from the DOB, assuming that you're going to get approved. And, in terms of that, fastest I've ever heard of it was a couple of months, but it could take a year or longer to wind up getting that approval until they actually reach out to all those tenants and, find out what the responses were.
So if you were a buyer, that is essentially a major requirement in terms of purchasing a townhome, is if it is an SRO currently, you would want to see a certificate of non-harassment.
Typically, yes, but there are buyers out there that do want to buy the home as an SRO. For instance, a lot of people are now using it as, quote, these bed and breakfast type of, environment and, rent them out and, receive the kind of income that they're getting.
But these are not really, an SRO is not really a bed and breakfast. You could have a tenant in there for a lot longer than just a weekend.
Yeah, and in fact, you're gonna kind of bump up, and I don't know all the specifics on this. You'll want to speak to an attorney on some of these aspects, but yeah, these are typically going to be longer term because now you're bumping up against like Airbnb and some of the requirements that were put in place against the Airbnb world. So yeah, you'll want to definitely consult with an attorney is number one, and number two, what happens if after a tenant stays at the house for 30 days or more and they're quite savvy on the rent laws? So one of the big concerns on owning an SRO is that tenant can request, as long as they're there at least 30 days, they can request a rent stabilized apartment or rent stabilized lease. And as an SRO owner, you are obligated to offer it to them.
So whenever you see in a townhouse listing that it is an SRO or categorized as an SRO, I guess what that means is if you were intending to use the home as a single family or a 1 or 2 family home, it can be challenging to get the certificate of occupancy updated unless you have a certificate of non-harassment.
That's correct. So typically these might have a certificate of occupancy or CFO. They might have the CFO listing it as like an 8 family or 10 family, and that's just reflective of the number of rooms. Suppose if you wanted it, as a single family, and if you want to start making substantial changes to it, number one, it would need to be unoccupied. Number two, in order to legally do it, aside from just basic routine maintenance of the home, if you wanted to do a gut renovation, you could wind up getting fined from the DOB if you do not have the CFO reflecting a proper like 1 family at that point. So these things are very complicated to purchase. Without that certificate of non-harassment, and moving that in, it's going to be difficult to get financing. But there are people out there that might consider these types of things if they're looking for the rental income. And, you can wind up getting a higher rate of return on these, but they're definitely not for the uninitiated. They're definitely not for an amateur buyer. I would recommend that if somebody were to consider buying an SRO as SRO status, that they are a professional investor and they have experience owning and running rentals in New York City.
So if you were a townhouse buyer, but you were interested in living in the unit, but maybe renting out another, let's say, room or floor, what would be the type of occupancy you would be looking for?
Ultimately, you're looking to do whether they're 2 family, 3 family, and do it as a traditional, offer the apartment as a traditional lease. That's not to say that you couldn't move into an SRO and occupy some of the rooms yourself, a part of the home yourself, and then still rent it out as an SRO. But as we said, there are challenges of doing that, including the financing and, potentially having rent stabilized tenants in there, which you will never be able to easily get them out if you wanted to change the situation. So yeah, it's not exactly the easiest scenario to want to play out, but yes, there are people that might want to keep it that way. If you don't want to keep it that way, then you're going to want the house unoccupied. You're going to want that certificate of non-harassment, and then only then can you start consulting with an architect and start trying to convert it legally through the DOB and make all the changes that the DOB requires in order to make it like a 1 through 4 family.
Great. Do you have any other things that you want to talk about in terms of townhouses?
Yeah, well, townhouses, obviously, we're talking about that in terms of if you're looking at multifamily aspects. If you're looking at buying, the home as a multifamily, let's say it's zoned as a 1 through 3 family, you're going to want to see what the setup sheet is. Now, if you're uninitiated with that term, it's basically the operating cost and the income that you're able to derive from the apartment. Obviously, it's on an estimated basis, but you can use that based off of like perhaps real bills that they're getting in, real Con Ed bills, real water and sewer bills that they're getting in. So that gives you at least some of the aspects of their taxes. A lot of times, and people ask me, about the tax structures on townhouses, and we know as agents that very often the property taxes in New York City are calculated based off of the value of rentals in the nearby area, and then they base it on on the value of the home, and they have algorithms and they have their process in which they do that. However, that said, it doesn't always make any kind of logical or reasonable sense. You'd have to, work with a tax certiorari in order to try and best figure out any kind of logic or reason some of the ways that the property tax structures are set up. So, yeah, that's definitely going to require certain expertise in order to understand it. But just know up front that that there's wide opportunities available, and sometimes they don't always make sense, but that's what a good agent is going to help you, differentiate. In terms of other things like owning a townhouse, just keep in mind, and some of this is a little similar to what you'll find in the rest of the nation. Unlike with condos and co-ops, you are now responsible for maintaining the structure yourself. That is, something that not everyone thinks about or thinks about entirely. So, for instance, many years ago, the city made changes to the way the laws were set up in terms of maintaining sidewalks. So when it snows, you get a break for, I think, a couple of inches. But once it's more than a couple inches and a few hours have passed, you are obligated to shovel the snow. Or at least hire somebody to shovel the snow, and keep the sidewalk free of any obstacles like such as trip hazards, and also what happens if the sewer system backs up or you have a water main break and you're flooded. Any connections, to your home are things that you need to be responsible for. So if it's an old original water main connection, you'll want to make sure that is updated. And make sure you're properly insured for that as well. These are, some of the important things to understand when it comes to maintaining a townhouse.
Do you want to talk about Harlem and sort of the different neighborhoods and types of townhouses you're going to find in each part of the neighborhood?
Yeah, so for the most part, when you're looking at Upper Manhattan, there are not too many townhouses that you'll find in as you go to the northern portion of even Manhattan, the most northern portion. So you'll find a handful in Inwood. You'll find a handful in Washington Heights. The vast majority of the townhouses that you're going to find, you're not going to find them in Morningside Heights for the most part. So the vast majority that you're going to find are going to be in Hamilton Heights and Central Harlem. In terms of there's those two neighborhoods actually have multiple historic districts. So those are going to be like the beautiful leafy kind of brownstone type blocks that you're going to find. And, there aren't as many shells available as there once were. When I remember moving into Harlem 15, 16 years ago, shells were plentiful in these neighborhoods.
A shell is
basically just four walls and may or may not have a roof. So very often it's a starting point to build almost a brand new home while using the existing original exterior in most cases.
So in other words, bricks on the outside, maybe nothing on the inside.
Yeah, quite possible. The floors, you might have floors inside, but they might be so unstable that you're pretty much considering no floors.
So let's just say if there is a typical shell, and I'm just going to imagine, you see them every once in a while if you walk through the city. You'll see that, probably boarded up, right? And we can assume that someone purchased them, and decided, okay, if they want to renovate the townhouse, they're basically starting right smack in the middle of the brick.
Yeah, and very often, and this is another consideration, because so many of these homes in Central Harlem and Hamilton Heights, they do tend to be in the historic districts, and quite frankly, the townhouses are really what makes the character of these historic districts. So that brings on limitations as to what you can do in terms of any kind of changes that you might want to make. Changing the interior is almost never an obstacle, but changing the exterior, especially anything street facing or visible from the street, that tends to be where the obstacles tend to lie. So, let's say you have the ability through the zoning of the particular house allows you to build an extra floor. But if you're in a historic district, they might not allow that extra floor. They might allow an extra half floor where it's set back from the street and it's not visible. That half floor structure is not available to view from the street. But you might be limited as to what you can do. But that said, it gives you an opportunity to really create your own home from scratch.
Wow. So it sounds to me like if you were in a historic district, let's make that assumption, you cannot touch the exterior of the building or modify it, but you can build a new interior.
For the most part, there are exceptions that can be made, but sometimes these historic districts, it could take years to sometimes get a decision out of them as to what you might be able to change. I've heard stories about a townhouse that in the 1960s or 70s, they took the stoop out from the building, and now, come the 2000s, the new owners of the building, they want to restore it back to its original character. And as much as you would think that would be in the character of the historic district, it took like almost 2 years for them to get approval to restore back what originally existed. So, and even sometimes something as simple as replacing windows, you're going to have to do it to match the historic character. So these tend to be challenges, and they're not quick, they're not cheap, they're not easy in order to maintain. So that's oftentimes why you do find these shells, is because the owners didn't have the wherewithal to be able to tackle these kind of things.
So it sounds like if you're thinking about renovating a townhouse, realize that it can take some time. It's not going to be something that's going to be, quick and easy for sure. You'd have to be able to work with an architect.
Well, yeah. First off, if you're talking about the exterior changes, especially if it's street facing, that's where it can be time consuming, expensive, difficult, challenging. But if you're talking about the interiors, or you're talking about the backyard exterior, or just fixing up the roof or something like that, where it's not visible from the street, or maybe even you're not in a historic district, then yeah, it's not as difficult or time consuming. In fact, if you're changing up a lot of the interior functions, because you are like the owner of the apartment, assuming that it is unoccupied, it's actually much easier to make changes in the interior of a townhouse than it is with condos and co-ops that require boards and review and engineering reviews, where if you want to change out the bathroom and you're not moving anything, you could just go to Home Depot and start doing it today,
So needless to say that the advantage of owning a townhouse building is that you own the building and basically do whatever you want with it.
Right, exactly. So, yeah, we've seen some things that obviously, if you're going to be moving things around in the house and changing up plumbing structures, changing a back wall into a glass curtain wall type of thing that was once brick, yeah, obviously you're going to need an architect or an engineer to review the project. But if you're doing something as like, I don't like this vanity anymore, I'm like, yeah, go ahead and just make that change. Go to, with whatever provider you want and make the change, and you don't have to ask anybody.
Great. Wow. So that sounds pretty exciting.
Yeah. That could be some of the fun things about owning a townhouse is you can make whatever changes you want to the interior, and, and it's just considered maintenance.
Great. Other things to consider about townhouses you want to mention?
Well, obviously, if you're you are, and we've kind of mentioned this before, but owning a townhouse, you're responsible for maintaining the house and the structure yourself. So not everyone takes these types of things into consideration, and it's something that you can't forget about, because obviously if you have people tripping and falling in the middle of winter, that risk is on you, and that's also why townhouse insurance can be much more expensive.
Yeah, obviously a major liability if someone hurts themselves.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so any final thoughts, Adam, on townhouses? You covered quite a bit, and I especially appreciate talking about certificate of occupancy, and also the fact that townhouse can provide a wonderful opportunity to rebuild from the inside, even though you obviously have to be careful if you're in a historic district about the exterior.
Yeah, I think the one last thing I want to talk about, since this is Harlem Stories, there tends to be a lot of underground streams in Harlem. So, that's just something to keep in mind. It's not unusual to see some of the cellar spaces, they do have floods, so they do have natural waterways underneath. They do occasionally flood, so it's not unusual to hear that. It's something to keep in mind. Especially for somebody that wants to try and convert that cellar space into some sort of usable space. Just know and understand the topography of the neighborhood, and before you start looking to make those changes, or even if it's in your head and saying, what, I want to buy this and start converting that cellar space. Well, food for thought.
Great. All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us, and stay tuned for the next episode of Harlem Stories.